good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. Happy to be here. I want to tell you a little bit about, Professor Hyde talked about these books that we've done. I'm still very much affiliated with the Institute for Faith, Work, and Economics, and our objective, and a lot of what I'm going to talk about tonight really comes from, some of it comes from this book, but is certainly the questions that I'm raising in the talk tonight are motivate questions like, how should Christians feel about capitalism? How should Christians think about caring for the poor, etc. I now work full-time at a place called the Fund for American Studies, so I just want to plug that for a minute, because I know all undergraduates or many are excited about internship opportunities. So what the Fund for American Study does is, and you can look all of this up online, but we have fall, spring, and summer internships where you spend a semester, or if you're in the summer, you spend a condensed semester in Washington, D.C. In many of these cases, the internships are kind of political in nature. Some people work on the Hill for a congressman or a senator. Some people, there are kind of 8 coveted State Department fellowships where you work for the State Department. This is really amazing. If you want to do that in the future in your career, it really opens up a lot of doors for you. But there's also think tank work, nonprofit work, and so you have this internship that you take 2 classes as well. And you take those classes at George Mason. I teach some of those classes, and the idea is that your semester also translates back into college credit towards your graduation requirements. So it's busy and jam-packed, but really fun. Lots of amazing opportunities. You also get to do a lot of fun stuff. So if anybody has any questions, I actually kind of have to get on an airplane almost as soon as I'm done here today, but I'll make sure my email is available, and if you're interested in talking to me one-on-one about some of those opportunities, I'd be happy to talk to you about them. We also have 3 overseas programs. So there's a Prague program, which is where I got my start in TFAS as a graduate student. It's amazing. There's one in Hong Kong, and then there's one in the winter semester in January in Chile. So really cool opportunities for students. So what I want to talk about tonight is, Professor Hyde and I have talked about this for over the years, and as I said, these questions have motivated my research. And I want to give an overview or a big picture tonight, but what does Scripture tell us about who we are and what we're supposed to do? So that's kind of the basic, I think, the questions that we always have to start with. And when doing that, I like to go to Genesis, because I think Genesis provides the roadmap for what we're supposed to do and for who we are. And I think a lot of times if you're reading Genesis in your private study or in Sunday school class, we tend to think it gives us a lot of information about how the earth was created and the time frame and the sequence and things like that. But I think we overlook perhaps some of what's profoundly important in Genesis, which is this idea of human anthropology and what I call, this is not really my word, but the mandate to work. And so I want to talk a little bit about that today, and then I'm going to try to end with what is this, how do the implications of what we see theologically in Genesis, how do they inform how we should live today? And of course, what should we agitate for? I've never been in a room of Christians and said something like, hey, Christians are called to care for the poor, and have anybody disagree with me on that, right? That's kind of obvious, it's a no-brainer. We see it time and time again in Scripture, but where the disagreement certainly comes among Christians and non-Christians is, how do we care for the poor? So I don't think we can get to the how until we understand the what and the who. And so that's what I want to start with today. I'm not going to read all of this to you, but I do think maybe if you have time on your own to go back and read the first and second chapters in Genesis. They give us a lot of really valuable information to, again, answer these big questions that are very relevant for our lives in the 21st century. So here we see, then God said, let us make mankind in our image and our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground. So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them. So there's a lot of intentional repetition here. We are imago Dei. We are made in the image of God. That alone has profound implications for not only what we can do, but what we are required to do. So again, I think Genesis gives us a lot of this information and can help us answer the how, right? Which kind of translate often into policy types of questions. So we're made in the image of God. It's really important to remember here, of course, God is ultimately, he's the ultimate architect, the ultimate artist, the ultimate creator, right? He can create something out of nothing. We cannot. But we can and are asked to create something out of something. So the word that has kind of been agreed upon by the theologians I work with is that we're not co-creators with God, because I think that elevates us to a level of our capabilities that isn't there, but we're sub-creators. So God is the ultimate creator. Genesis is a story of that creation. We're to do the same thing, even though we can't do it in the exact same way. It's harder for us, of course, right? We're finite. Then verse 28, God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it. Fill the earth. I highlight, that's my highlight, right? The earth. The idea here is that, even again, if going back and reading the account of Genesis, the idea here is that we were never to remain in the garden. That was never the intention. We were always to fill the whole earth. Now, there's theological debate about whether that was an extension of the garden, we were to extend the garden over the whole earth, or whether we were to leave the garden, go into the rest of the earth, and build cities. But we know we're to be fruitful and increase in number. We kind of understand the increase in number, right? This is the value and the importance of family. And we understand that, I think, as Christians, and the role of the family is crucial for a flourishing society. But we also have to be fruitful. What does that mean? And I think we can go to the second chapter of Genesis and get a lot of information about this, right? So Genesis 2:15 says, the Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and care for it. Again, if you read and you translate this from the original Hebrew, it's important to note that these are two separate clauses here. We're to work it and we're to care for it. Those are different things that work together and in fact are not contradictory. So I want you to think about what it means to care for something. So if you've ever kind of watched somebody's house while they're on vacation, right? Or you've ever been taking a job as a babysitter or, a pet sitter or whatever, right? You're taking care of. When you watch somebody's house when they're on vacation, you bring the newspapers in, you make sure the lights are on at night, you make sure the doors are locked when you leave, right? You're not building an addition on the back of the house. That's beyond the scope of your responsibility. You're preserving, you're caring for. We are called to do that, which implies that as we work, as we do our jobs here, we are not to destroy the earth. We're to take care of. But that's not all it says, and that's really important. That's not the only clause. It says we're to work it. The original Hebrew word is abad. And I'm going to come back to this a few times in the talk. Abad, translated, means to serve. So we're to serve and to take care of. When you unpack the word to serve, it means that you're going to change it. Right? So God didn't say, okay, I've made this beautiful earth and all the things in it. I've put you on it. Now watch over every blade of grass and make sure nothing ever gets touched. That's not the mandate. The mandate is make sure it doesn't get destroyed, but be fruitful. Take your human creativity, apply it to what I've given you, and make something more. Serve it. And in serving it, you're serving each other. And we'll get to that in a moment. So these two clauses here are incredibly important because it tells us what we're supposed to do. We're not just preserving, right? We're not park rangers. When you think about going to a park, that's the park ranger's job, right? They're to make sure you pick up after yourself. They're to make sure that you don't destroy what's out there in nature. But we are, in fact, to cultivate. So that's part of what we do as people who are imago Dei. At being image bearers of God means that we're creators. And I'm going to get to this in a minute. I think really economics and the economic way of thinking fall very nicely out of this understanding of human anthropology. So in an econ class, at least if you took me as an econ professor, the first thing I start with is human anthropology, because economics is the discipline or the science of understanding human choice under conditions of scarcity, right? And so we're all doing this kind of stuff. We're all wrestling with what are the best choices, how do we choose, how do we decide. But economics is fundamentally a discipline that studies human beings. So we can't do good economics if we don't start with a proper understanding of the human person, what we're called to do, and what our constraints are, right? So here I take us to kind of the fall. The fall is really important, obviously, for a lot of reasons. But I think one thing we take away from the fall is, of course, our brokenness from the fall, it doesn't just break us individually. It breaks our relationship with ourselves, with God, with each other, and with the creation. So you go back to the first chapter of Genesis, everything that we're told to do is made that much more difficult because of the fall. The fall means there's frustration, there's sin, there's error, there's greed, there's bad judgment, there's all sorts of things. See, before the fall, we were still finite. We had to learn, right? We had to figure things out. So I always think, I always say this to my students. In the garden, there was everything needed to create the smartphone. You had everything you needed on the seventh day of creation to get a smartphone, right? But you had to figure it out. You had to understand the uses of all those raw materials. And, what the most important aspect of economics is human ingenuity, of course. Applying your reason and your thinking and your creativity to those things to make something that wasn't there before. But of course, it took us a long time to get that smartphone, didn't it? Didn't happen on the 8th day. Part of that is because of the fall. Because our efforts now are filled with frustration. But I think the important part, and why I bring this up, it does not undo the mandate we receive in chapter 1. We're still to be fruitful and multiply. We are still imago Dei, even though we're broken and fallen. So while our job is now more difficult than it would have been without the fall, our job remains. We're still to do what we were always asked to do. Our marching orders are still in progress. So we have to figure out how to do that, right? And this brings about a lot of constraints, right? We know that our labor is going to be frustrating, and we're not always going to want to do it. The theologians in particular that I work with when we write these books have this idea, and I like this idea. Of course, I won't be able to verify it to you until I too am in heaven. But their idea is that in heaven we will still work. Why? Because it's what we were ultimately created to do. We'll still do that. It just won't be filled and mired with frustration. It will be a different kind of work. So it will be work as it was meant to be before the fall. Okay? So the fall changes how we do this, but it doesn't change what we're supposed to do. We still must persevere. And what is the goal of all of this? The goal of all of this is human flourishing. Human flourishing is a word that's getting a lot of traction these days, and I'm happy about that. I think there's a lot of different interpretations of what it means to experience human flourishing. And I think as Christians we need to be careful to talk about biblical flourishing. So there's a theologian named Jonathan Pennington. You can find a very kind of thoughtful paper he's written on human flourishing on our website. And he talks really about the idea that human flourishing is shalom. Now I want somebody to tell me, when you read shalom in the scriptures, what word comes to your mind?
Peace.
Peace, right? This is kind of how we truncate that definition in our heads. I don't think that's necessarily wrong, but I think it's insufficient. It's an insufficient understanding of what shalom is. Shalom is true flourishing. It's things working the way they're supposed to work. It's, peace is just the absence of conflict, which of course is good, but it's not everything. We need the absence of conflict and an environment of cooperation and trust, right, to experience human flourishing. So this is just a snippet from Pennington. He says, flourishing encapsulates human health, wholeness, resulting in strength, fertility, and longevity. The vision of shalom is at the core of God's redeeming work. That's pretty powerful. The reason we're here is part of the redemptive narrative to bring about shalom. Which means, if you go back to the first chapter of Genesis, work, what we're supposed to do, when you do your work well, as God has created you to do it, you are reweaving shalom. You are not only benefiting personally, but you're extending the benefits of your human creativity to your fellow human beings. That's what we're supposed to do. Now, if all this is true, if you buy any of this, then it has really profound implications for the type of society in which we need to live. There are societies that can be constructed in ways that allow more human flourishing, and there are societies that walk straight away from human flourishing. That's not an accident, right? If we construct societies based on false presumptions of the human person and what they're capable of and what their constraints are, then we're going to go in the wrong direction, and human immiseration will result. I mean, I'm an economist, so I think about this kind of stuff all the time, but just do a Google search on Venezuela, and you will get hit after hit, article after article about human immiseration that is wholly unnecessary. People are starving and dying in Venezuela today, and it's not necessary. 40 years ago, this is a country it would have gone to for vacation. It was a democracy, it was wealthy. Now, people are trying to get out. I read that the government is going to basically install labor camps. So it's headed on the road to serfdom, as Hayek would say, right? So you can get human immiseration from constructing society based on false premises about the human person, or you can get the opposite. And so I'm saying here, our goal is human flourishing, but here's an important point as well. Human flourishing, biblical human flourishing, includes material prosperity. Sometimes that's a controversial thing to say. I don't think it is if you really unpack Genesis and you think about what God is asking us to do. But look at the things he talked about here. Human health. For most of human history, people have been very poor and lived very short lives because they didn't have access to routine medical care that you and I take for granted, right? So human health is advanced with material prosperity. The richer we are, the more money we can dedicate to eradicating the next disease, etc. Right? And so human health, strength, fertility, and longevity. You live longer as a result of material prosperity. It is material well-being that extends your life. Angus Deaton, who won the Nobel Prize in 2015, has a fantastic book called The Great Escape. It's about the global escape out of poverty. And he says that a female in the United States born in 2015 has a 50-50 chance of living to 100. That's phenomenal and unprecedented. Right? In 1900, the average lifespan of the average American was about 49 years old. And that's not that long ago. So material prosperity is part of reweaving shalom. Right? It's not the only thing. Material prosperity can't save our souls. I'm not making that claim. But I'm saying that the pursuit of biblical human flourishing includes an understanding of how to allow people to create, and the result of that creativity is that they become more prosperous. And again, we don't want the money for its own sake, right? We want the money because what does it allow us to do? A lot of other things. It allows us to be good stewards, and I'll get to that in a little bit. So without, when you're talking about stuff like this and you don't want to run the risk, I think it's very careful. We try to be very careful in the books and the research that we do to not cherry pick scripture to kind of fit into worldviews that we already have. Scripture doesn't contradict itself. So while I'm focusing on Genesis, you can go through both the Old and New Testament and see what I like to call the meta-narrative of Scripture tends to support the claims that I'm making here. That human flourishing is part of God's design and his desires for his creation. So here's just another example of that. Jeremiah 29, which is also something I would encourage you to go back and read again. I'm sure you've read it before. But this is a letter written by the prophet Jeremiah to people who have been taken into exile. They're strangers in a strange land. And if you read the whole, not just this verse, but if you read the whole chapter, what Jeremiah says is, do not be dismayed by being in exile. In fact, I want you to do everything you were going to do before. I want you to marry off your daughters. I want you to build cities. I want you to work. I want you to extend cultures and build cultures. This verse says, seek the peace and the prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile, for if it prospers, you prosper. That's really important. Biblical prosperity is mutual. It's not exploitative. It's mutual. Seek the peace and the prosperity of the city. We're supposed to seek those things. The prosperity of the city. Because after all, what is a city? It's a group of individuals that are working together under some shared identity, right? Seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you. If it prospers, you prosper. If you read The Wealth of Nations, you see Adam Smith make very similar claims. He says, a society cannot be wealthy if the majority of its citizens are in poverty. Because the prosperity of the city depends on the prosperity of its individual members and vice versa. That's an important aspect, though, about biblical prosperity. It's not an exploitative game. It's not a game of plunder. It's a game of cooperation, of trust, of working together to, again, abad, serve one another. That's what we're after here. So I want to kind of transition from the theological framework to some of the economics. As I said, I think good economics is good because it falls back on an understanding of the human person. That's its starting point. And of course, we can see many episodes of economics that have gone in wrong directions, and there's consequences for that. I think to start out here, I would say, there's key aspects of human anthropology that matter here. One is that we're unique. That's not really a profound or radical claim, but it's really important. I use the snowflake here as an analogy. There's never been another you to walk the planet. You are you. You are unique. You bear, kind of physiologically similar characteristics and traits with a lot of other human beings. Think about your professors that are in the room, right? As a professor, I do what a lot of other professors do, but I can only do it like Anne Bradley, which is my own unique combination of the way I see the world and my own unique, combination of human creativity. And I can be a professor in the way that God leads me to do that. But I can only do it in my way. That's the same for all of you. So there's never been another you that's walked the planet, and there never will be. What's profound about that is it means that what you do is significant. You were created to do something significant. At the Institute for Faith, Work, and Economics, where I was for a long time, we talked a lot about this because I think in Christian theology over the past 150 years, there's been a very dangerous segregation of the sacred and the secular, where we believe that the time you spend in church, the time you spend in prayer, the money that you give, tithing, the time you're volunteering with the youth group, that those things are sacred and they matter and they're valuable and they're important and God cares about them. But if you go to work during the day as a professor or a coach or a teacher or an accountant or a software engineer, that's secular. God doesn't care. That is incorrect theology, the way that I read Genesis and beyond. So that's exciting and powerful, but brings a lot of responsibilities for each of us, right? Which is that if you're a software engineer, it's significant. And you're to do it with excellence and integrity. And in doing that well, you are abad, you are serving fellow human beings. But again, this requires the right environment. So there's a lot that hangs in the balance of whether we can do this well. We have purpose. Right? We're not the little old-fashioned wind-up toys that run across the room after you wind up their back, right? We're not pre-programmed. We do things with purpose. And our purpose, of course, needs to be grounded in the right things. But again, this has implications for whether we can plan and manage economic systems, right? But people pursue things based on their own self-interest, and we're profit seekers. That's also not among economists, but in some circles when I mention that, it sounds controversial, that we're all profit seekers. And the way I want you to translate the word profit is to say leftovers. A profit is a leftover. It's what's reserved, what's left after you've expended your costs and your energies, right? We all want leftovers. Think about going out to lunch, right? And you get a big plate and you get that to-go container, now you have dinner. Leftovers are good. We like leftovers. We tend to think of leftovers and profit as only monetary, and that's also incorrect. The most precious, valuable resource that you have is your time. And being a good steward in the pursuit of God's purposes requires that every moment matter to you, and that you use your moments judiciously, right, for His purposes. So profiting, this gets back to that human flourishing, that shalom slide that I showed. When we pursue profit in a kind of God-centered way, thinking about His purposes and using our human creativity for His purposes, then we want to make as much profit as possible. Profit in this case is not exploitative. It's not I stole from you and so I got something for myself. Profit can, and this is where I have to show a slide of Adam Smith, of course, can exist in a world where both parties are better off, right? So this is a kind of profound insight of Adam Smith. Of course, we call him the father of modern economics, and I would say, while not a Christian, what made Adam Smith a really good economist is he understood human beings. That was his starting point. He wanted to understand what motivated people and what were the pitfalls of wealth, etc. And so what he came up with was this idea that our individual ambition, our motivation of self-love can actually be translated into something that allows us and motivates us to find ways to serve one another. And I would encourage you to think about that, because that's the world we want to live in. We want to live in a world where strangers wake up in the morning and think about discovering the next new thing that we want and need. I think about this particularly in healthcare, right? We want people dedicating their energy to think about solving those problems. And I bring this scripture to us because I think this shows us that self-interest is not inherently evil or wrong. It's different than greed. Self-interest is just a mechanism of choice. It's how you choose what you choose. It can go awry, of course, because we're fallen and broken and mistaken sometimes. Let each of you look not only to his own interest, but also to the interest of others. It's not bad to look out for yourself, right? You are in charge of this. You have to look out for yourself, but you don't want to do that at the cost of everything else, right? At the expense of everyone else. So again, we want to live in a world where we're induced to cooperate, because when we're induced to cooperate, we're going to abide. We're going to find ways to serve each other. And I think that's what we're after. And again, that's going to lead us to some economic questions about what is the best model of an economic and political system that's going to allow people to do this. And I'm going to be very straightforward. I mean, there's no place in Scripture that says, God says go be capitalist, or God says go be socialist, even though there's a lot of debate among scholars of whether the Bible advocates for capitalism or socialism. It really says neither, right? But it lays forth principles of how we're to live our lives and how we're to treat other people and what institutions we should agitate for that I think can lead us to really thoughtful conclusions about those big, important questions. So I want to kind of talk a little bit here about what we call in economics maybe the model of human action. And this is really important because this applies to all people. Again, why this is, I think, an important starting point for economics is it understands human decision making. So this comes to us from an economist named Ludwig von Mises, who wrote a very large book called Human Action. I'm giving you the one-slide summary of that book. And there's 3 bullet points. He basically says there's 3 things that need to happen, to occur, for us to be willing to engage in economic exchange. And one is we experience a state of uneasiness. And so that motivates us to do something different, right? So think of a very basic example. You wake up in the morning and you're hungry. You're uneasy about that hunger, right? And so that's motivating you to do something, right? But you're not going to do something unless these other 2 points hold, which is 1, you have a vision for a better outcome. You can imagine a world in which you're no longer hungry, right? And then number 3, you take conscious and purposeful steps to get there. So this doesn't mean that all things that human beings do are good, are just, are righteous, are motivated in the right way. We're not saying any of that stuff as economists, but what we are saying is that human action is purposeful. That we engage in this thought process before we do things, right? And so we want to examine the motivations of people for why they do these things. And again, if these are our realities of human anthropology, then we need to say, if this is true, what type of social and economic order is required? I want to go through a few more kind of what I call the realities of economics. Economics is a social science. It's different than the hard sciences, but I would say that there are realities of economics that hold in the same way that the reality of gravity holds for you, right? The reason you don't walk off the top of tall buildings is because there's consequences to doing that, right? You will hurt yourself if you do that. So you don't do it. The same realities hold in the discipline of economics. And the first one that's the most important is the reality of scarcity. We live in a world of abundance. The garden was a place of abundance, but it was still finite. Think about the garden. There was still a countable number of trees. There weren't infinite numbers of trees. So we were finite, and the resources were finite. They're still true today. One of the most interesting questions of the abundance we face today is, especially as people who live in the United States, is that there's so many people potentially vying for so many scarce resources, yet there's, very few people go to bed at night in the United States wondering, where am I going to get a pencil? Where can I buy printer paper? You know, what am I going to do about eating breakfast tomorrow? Not the reality in Venezuela, right? Once a very wealthy country that had conquered some of these issues, now people very much worry about when they're going to get their next meal. And if you send your child to a hospital in Venezuela, not only are they not going to get the very basic antibiotics that they need, but they will probably die while they're in there because they are filthy. There's no janitors, there's no bleach, there's nothing. So a hospital isn't a place you go in Venezuela today that makes you better. It makes you worse. Why, right? It's about understanding the limits here and how to create abundance out of scarcity. That's the name of the game. And remember, why is this important for Christians? Because human prosperity is a crucial aspect of biblical human flourishing. So what is the importance here? And I use these examples very intentionally. There's a great article, maybe your professors have made you read it, maybe not. It's called I, Pencil. And it's a 4-page article you can find free online. It was written in 1945, maybe 1950. It's old. And the idea is it's the pencil telling the story of its own existence. And the story of the pencil is that no one in the world, both in 1950 when the article was written and now, nobody knows how to make a pencil. Not even the CEO of the pencil company. They know how to buy all the resources to make a pencil happen. But no one person left to their own devices can make a pencil. And a pencil is pretty simple. Think about that compared to a laptop, right? Or an HVAC system or something that's much more sophisticated. So how does the pencil come to be? The pencil comes to be by all these dispersed individuals being motivated by the profit motive to do different things, including logging, and make those scarce resources into the variety of consumer goods that people want and need, right? So scarcity is our reality. If we construct an economic and political system as if scarcity is not a problem, we will in fact make scarcity worse, and we will immiserate people. So we have to deal with this, and again, the question is, of course, biblically, how do we live in a world of scarcity where people are self-interested and sometimes greedy and create abundance and have the right incentives to serve one another? Well, there we go, and that's kind of a nice segue into the next economic reality, which is people respond to incentives. Okay? People always respond to the incentives that they face. This is an insight of economics. It doesn't really sound like rocket science, but it's important because it means, and the picture I put up here, does anybody know what this is a picture of? What store is this? Walmart. You know, Walmart's mission statement is, I think it's save money, live better. It's a good mission statement, right? Everybody likes to save money. But it begs the bigger question, are they running this giant global corporation? They're the world's largest grocer, by the way. Are they doing this because they're altruists who want to make sure you pay as little as possible for your shampoo?
Nope.
Probably not. I mean, maybe. I don't know the Walton family, and I didn't, you know, I've read Sam Walton's biography. He's probably a good guy. But we don't have to rely on that. We don't have to have that. Getting a productive society is not a question of getting all the Mother Teresas to run the corporations. There's not enough Mother Teresas. It's actually taking people as they are and giving them incentives to serve. So you find Walmart is profoundly profitable. Why? Because they picked the right mission statement. People actually care a lot about saving money. And you know who the benefits are extended the most to around this? People at the bottom of the income distribution. Because Bill Gates, he doesn't even do his own grocery shopping. Let's face it, he doesn't even know how much his Cheerios cost. Right? It's $1 more or less, who cares? When you have that much, it's not a concern. But think about the single mother living in a suburb close to me in Baltimore. Living in, you know, in the middle of gangs. And she has to go and provide for her family. Walmart is incredibly important for her to be able to do that and make each penny go as far as possible, right? So the idea here is that Walmart is not necessarily benevolent. I mean, maybe they're good church-going people, I don't know. But the important thing is that doesn't matter. At least for getting them to do the service that we want them to do. I'm not saying it doesn't matter spiritually, of course it does. Right? But people respond to incentives. So we need a society in which there's incentives for lots of smart people, innovative people, entrepreneurial people to do just that. And then the other, I think, really profound and under-discussed reality of economics is that we're interdependent. There's this idea that's really kind of, it's a criticism that's levied against people on the right. That, you know, kind of right-wing people are rugged individualists and they kind of advocate for rugged individualism. And I think that's a mistake. I don't think, I mean, as an economist, I would never advocate for rugged individualism, because it's a miserable state of affairs. Has anybody seen this movie?
Castaway.
Castaway. I used to make my principal students watch it and talk. There's a lot of economics in there. But this is a great movie. It's kind of dated at this point. But this is Tom Hanks. He's a Federal Express executive. It's Christmas Eve. He's proposed to his girlfriend. Life is great. He gets on a cargo plane to go home, and the plane crashes. And the rest of the movie and the brilliance of the movie is that he's just by himself trying to figure stuff out that the day before he didn't have to figure out. What's the difference? He's by himself, right? And so my favorite scene, I think, in the movie is when he figures out how to make fire. And he's like sweating, and he looks like a crazy bearded guy here. He's been there for a while, and he's rubbing these sticks together. It's very intense, and the sweat is dripping on just a little tiny amount of smoke. You see these almost there, and I'm worried, at least when I watch it, that the sweat is going to drip and put it out. And he's very intense, and he gets it, and then it goes away. And you think, oh, he's just going to go like end it all and jump off a cliff. And he tries again, and he gets the fire. And the next scene, this is daytime, the next scene is the world's biggest bonfire on the beach, and he's running around screaming, I made fire. And it's a good day for him. We do this on camping trips for fun, right? But only because we're profoundly wealthy and we're able to do that. And by the way, anybody who goes on a camping trip goes to Walmart first, right, to get all the stuff so you make a campfire. So that the whole movie is the struggle to exist by yourself. It's wretched. We were not made to exist by ourselves. We were made to live in community, which is also part of the Imago Dei, right? God is communal. So we are communal. We need each other. So this interdependency requires what I call the 3 Ps. If we are in fact unique, purposeful, self-interested, and respond to incentives, and interdependent, and we live in a world of scarcity, then we need the 3 Ps. We need prices, we need property rights, and we need profits and losses. Those are the benchmarks of a market economy that do what? They turn people from being inward-focused only into being outward-focused. It gets you off the island, these 3 things. Gets us off the island. And we don't want to be on the island. We need each other, right? And so for an economist, what we would talk about is this is propelled, magnified, enhanced by trade. Trade really is kind of necessary for us to get off the island, right? It's the thing that we need to thrive, to flourish. We cannot, like Tom Hanks on that island, he's not really flourishing very much. He has moments, glimpses of happiness, but he even makes friends with a bloody volleyball, right? That's how much we need people. We can't do this by ourselves. So trade brings us into interdependent relationship with strangers. So it allows us not just to serve and love our neighbor, but it allows us to serve and love people we will never meet. Think about Walmart. They are serving people they will never meet. So the benefits can be extended over, volumes and volumes of people. So trade increases opportunities for the poor. Here's an example that I like to give of this. There's a lot of research in development economics about water collection. I think this is a modern, real example of what it's like to be forced inward, to have to do lots of things on your own. So this is a real picture. I didn't take it, but it's a woman and her child, and they're collecting water from a river. The river certainly is home for animals to bathe in and things. And they have these kind of disgusting, discarded containers that you and I would never drink out of because we don't have to, but they in fact do. The research suggests that people that have to do this are living under kind of world poverty standards, so $2 a day or less. And the research further suggests that these women run out of calories every day before they run out of income. And I want you to let that sink in for a minute. What does that mean? It means to do this kind of thing, walk 4 miles, collect the water, walk 4 miles back home. The water can weigh up to 50 pounds. You're hauling it back. That requires thousands of calories to be able to do. Think about what you do before you go on a long run or have a heavy workout. I ran cross country in high school, and we had carb nights, spaghetti dinners, before we would run the next day. Again, because we're so wealthy that we eat a lot and then we run a lot because we can. It's leisure. This is not leisure. This is a necessity. All right? And so she runs out of calories before she runs out of money every day. But she's doing it herself. And by the way, what we know is that their daughters are brought along with them to help. So any kind of limited educational opportunities in the developing world, often female children are left out of because they're collecting the water. So this is a very high opportunity cost activity. It takes all of our time, it takes all of our energy, and you got to keep getting the water every day. This is how you and I get water. I'm going to tell you exactly how I get water. I have 2 kids. One is 9, one is 5. I put them in my minivan, and I drive about 3.5 miles to the nearest grocery store, and I get them out of the minivan, and I put them in the shopping cart, and I go get water from a shelf where there's nicely packaged, neatly stacked, lots of varieties wrapped up for me. And you know the funny thing is, I don't even need the bottled water, because I have water, drinkable water, from many sources in my own home. Faucets, refrigerators, etc. This is a pure luxury to have it in this form, right? So that's the difference. This cost me about 20 minutes of my time, and I would say it cost me about less than 100 calories. It takes her all day, and more calories than she can consume in the day to do the task. So what she needs is a Walmart on the corner, and a Harris Teeter, and whatever the grocery stores are, right? That's what she needs. Because when she is allowed to participate in the trade, it frees her up from having to do this, and she can do other things, right? It allows her to experience more, relatively more, human flourishing. Not that you can't flourish if you're poor, that's not what I'm saying. But she's excluded from a lot of opportunities because she has to do this all the time. I would say to you that the good news is that this is changing. I'm an economist, I have to show at least one graph in a talk or we get fined. So here's your graph. This is a good one. This is world GDP from AD 1, long time ago. We didn't have a Census Bureau, so these are back of the envelope calculations, but they've been repeated many times, to about now. And I want you to pay attention to the orange line. We call this the hockey stick graph. Most humans over most of human history have lived at between $0 and $400 a year. That's why this line is hovering over 0 for most of human history. And then it just kind of goes bananas, right? And we call this what? What happens around here? Industrial Revolution. And boom. And the whole world has been brought up with this. So this is every country's GDP, the richest and the poorest. So everybody's getting richer, and that's a good thing, but we want to hasten that process, right? And again, money can't save our souls. So I'm not saying this is the silver bullet to everything. It's not going to bring us perfect shalom. But it's certainly necessary, right? Going back and thinking about the water collection. This has happened, by the way, at a time when population is exponentially increasing. So we can literally have our cake and eat it too. You can grow the world's population and grow the world's wealth. So human beings are not a curse to the planet. They're actually, if we view human beings in the right way, and our legal and political systems view human beings in the biblical way, then you can actually, human beings are a benefit to the planet and to each other, right? Because more people that we can trade with, that we can cooperate with, and more people that can unleash their human creativity. How is this fostered? By a society that kind of advances economic freedom. So I just want to talk really briefly about what economic freedom is. You can learn a lot more about it online. Milton Friedman in the 70s said, okay, we talk about prosperity all the time. What do we mean when we say that word? Let's measure it. That's what economists like to do, right? Let's measure it. So he came up with this index, and it measures every country that we can collect data for, and it scores them from 0 to 10. 0 means no economic freedom, 10 means perfect economic freedom. When we score the countries, these are the types of the things we're looking at. How are the property rights in the country? How are they enforced? Is there a rule of law? Is the currency sound? Is the government small relative to the size of the economy? Is there freedom to trade internationally? Again, that's what gets you off the island. And what's the level of regulation? Is it easy to open a business, start a business, etc.? Do you have to pay a lot of bribes? This type of thing. And what we find is that as economic freedom goes up, the biggest positive correlation that is held very consistently over time is that as a country's economic freedom score goes up, so does the average income in that country. So again, economic freedom, while you'll never see that word in Scripture, what is important about it is it allows ordinary people to steward their time in the most productive ways possible and provides them incentives to serve one another. That's what we need. And I think it's a big part of how we help the poor. I want to end with one story. You may have heard it before. Professor Haig probably heard this one. This is in the book Basic Economics. It's been told other places. And this is a real story. Does anybody know who this is a picture of? Boris Yeltsin. So this picture is from about 1991. He was then the new president of Russia after the failure of Mikhail Gorbachev, and before that, the fall of the Soviet Union. And he is in Houston, Texas, for a diplomatic visit. They were at the Johnson Space Center, and Yeltsin says, "I would like to go to a grocery store." So I can only imagine the Secret Service brouhaha that happened at that moment, but they made it happen. And this is a picture of Boris Yeltsin in a grocery store called Randall's. It's still around today, Randall's grocery store in Houston, Texas. He's very excited. He's in the popsicle aisle. It's an exciting aisle. And it really changed his life to go to an ordinary American grocery store. Okay, so the reason that I tell this story is this is a politically powerful person, maybe one of the most powerful people in the world at the time. One of the most connected people, one of the richest people. And you know what Russia never had? Grocery stores. He went to the manager of the grocery store and said, "Do you have to have special training to run a grocery store?" Which we would laugh at. But to Yeltsin, when you run society, when experts run economic systems, then they couldn't get grocery stores because they couldn't figure out the right formula. But if they could figure it out, then they could plan grocery stores. But what he saw by coming to this grocery store is that grocery stores aren't planned. They emerge. They come out of human exchange. And they're wonderful. He said in his autobiography, he writes about this experience. And he says, "I was both overwhelmed and depressed." He was overwhelmed that there's just rows and rows and rows of stuff neatly stocked for people, waiting for the people. The food waited for the people, which is the opposite of Soviet Russia. People waited for the food and starved in the process. That's what's happening in Venezuela today. People wait for the food and they're starving in the process. So he was overwhelmed, but he was depressed because he said, the little old ladies are like pushing their carts and nobody's excited. It's like mundane to them, it's boring. I admittedly complain when I have to take my 2 children to the grocery store on Saturday. Shame on me for complaining, right? Because there are people in the world that don't have this. So I think this is a great story of when we shift our thinking about what people are capable of, what Scripture requires us to do, then we get a good picture of what type of society we should be agitating for. And I think if we can have that conversation, we'll get further down the road about the policy questions that we all care about. So I'm going to stop there. Is that good? And take some time for questions if you have any. Criticisms, I'll take it all. Yeah?
2 questions. The first one is, does the graph of how much people make per year, was that graph, what's the word, inflation, does that also include inflation in that graph?
Yes. So this is the best data you can get in this graph. It's adjusted not only for inflation, but it's adjusted for purchasing power parity. So it's trying to equate currencies and the value of those currencies. So it's really trying to help you understand the bundle of things that people can purchase. So yeah, this is a sophisticated number rather than just a nominal number. It's a real number. To use that distinction, yeah. Which I think is great news, of course. There's a really interesting website you should look at. It's called the World Poverty Clock. And it's cool because you can go there and it's visualized data. So it shows every day the number of people running out of poverty. They have little graphics to show it. And the people that fell into poverty. And of course the goal is to always have people escaping poverty be much greater than people entering poverty. But the World Bank is projecting, based on kind of looking at these types of numbers for years now, that abject poverty, which is defined at living under $2 or $1.90 a day, will be eradicated by 2030. It will be about 3%. And we call that transitional poverty, so there'll always be a tsunami or an earthquake that temporarily displaces people. But think about it, the richer a country is, the better they can get around the tsunamis. And so I think that's really exciting data. So I think we're directionally headed in we're in a good direction. And that's, of course, one part of human flourishing. There's other parts we could talk about that aren't related to economics necessarily, but I think in this, we're headed in the right direction. But with Venezuela, what I get worried about, places like that, is that you can undo progress. And so there's a fragility to this type of environment, and I think it needs to be protected and defended, and bigger questions lie around how do we do that. Other questions? Yeah.
Yeah, you talk about the protecting, and I agree with a lot of basically everything you say, but you talk about a system that is designed to protect, like property rights, which I do believe is important. And I'm not sure what your ideal capitalism system is, but when you come into our governed capital or democratized capitalist system, those very property rights and the difference between protection and incentives become awfully blurred. And you can take, I don't know, let's take the housing industry.
Sure.
The difference, then that even transfers those incentives and encouragement to own that property, raises prices and distorts rational choices. You can go on and on and on, and then you end up with a financial system that the risk, the profits and losses were not realized and becomes systemic risk to all of us. That's flawed.
I 100% agree. And one way that we can track how we're doing on that, and when you look at the Economic Freedom of the World report, I wish I had put a picture of it.
And ours is declining, if I'm not mistaken.
So it's interesting. The new Economic Freedom of the World report from the Fraser Institute just came out 2 weeks ago. And for the first time in many years, the United States is back in the top 10. In the year 2000, we were number 2 in the world, second best. And we had systematically dropped a rank per year, and our score had dropped as well. And this is the first time I've seen us in the top 10 in at least 10 years. So, I'm trying to kind of dig into the data right now and say, okay, well, what's happening and where are we moving? For the United States, things like soundness of currency, we do exceptionally well on. We have a very conservative, predictable, and transparent central bank. It doesn't use the currency to kind of fund government projects. This is where I was worried, based on what you just talked about, the regulatory environment, because again, most businesses start as small businesses. Think of Bill Gates tinkering in his parents' garage in the 70s. I mean, this is how people start. Walmarts don't start out as a mega chain. They start out as something small that grow. Regulations can really harm people at the bottom, the entrepreneurs who don't have a lot of capital or resources to kind of jumpstart. So the housing industry is a great example of what I call cronyism.
It is.
And cronyism is picked up in this benchmark a lot. So I think that's where we're going to have to still make a lot more progress than we have.
If we go further on your cronyism, regulation, we think for democracy or elected officials. No, we're in this ABC regulation. That all these BPA, the SEC, these are all appointed. A lot of this is appointed bodies that make these laws. That's where the majority of the laws are coming from. They're through agencies. They're not through senators. Senators are busy funding the campaign.
And the one way to track this is the Federal Register, which lists all the business compliance, regulations, and it's just growing. So to me,
I guess my frustration is those are extreme barriers, social barriers, or institutional barriers.
Yep.
I guess I'm frustrated because I know that, my understanding of God's word, and if we serve all, not just Christians, but all of us, that's the answer. But trying to overcome what we've been led to believe, or the incentives we think will make a difference.
And this is an aside, but I wouldn't call the United States kind of a true capitalist economy. I would call it a mixed economy, which is what most of the world lives in, right? Mixed economy. And so there's a range of gray there where you can be productive and we have a lot of material wealth. But the question that an economist would ask is relative to what? How much better could it be in the U.S. if we did away with some of this stuff that hampers, kind of, as you said, cronies do well for themselves, which is why these systems are very hard to upend and change. So I think we need real thoughtfulness on that margin. Yeah.
The Economic Freedom Index, it's done separate from any consideration of GDP per capita, right?
So that we look at the outcomes of economic freedom. So one thing we do is we look at the scores that the country has across the barriers, and we relate it. We look at the correlation with GDP. But the economists are going in, and there's a lot of this is all data that they're gathering. So if you look in the index, each pillar here has a score, and they come up with a country score, but it's outside of GDP, yeah. Because GDP, I mean, I have to say, it's the worst. I mean, it's a blunt instrument. It's like stepping on the scale. The scale tells you a number, but it doesn't really tell you if that number is good for you, right? It's just a blunt instrument. So it's what we have, and economists use GDP, but I would like to use GDP with other things like this, which are much more robust. Is there another hand?
I got lots.
Yeah. Oh, wait, let me see.
I'll run out of
Yeah.
that.
Oh. Okay, so I heard you say flourishing comes from this trade, and you put the slide up there of Tom Hanks and so forth. But there are many, probably some in this room, who would say, no, there's too much trade, and we'll get wealthy by restricting some of that trade. We'll restrict imports from Canada or imports from China or whatever, and that'll make us wealthy. So what do you say to those people?
I would disagree with that line of argument. I'm teaching an international economics class right now, and that's all we talk about. Because in the news a lot right now. But I think the idea is that the first thing I would say is, I'll try to answer your question quickly, but the first thing I would say that trade is never really country to country. Trade is about people trading with other people. So when you go to the dollar store and you buy something that was made in China, you're trading with another human being and another corporation on the other side. You're not trading with China, you're trading with people. And so when we think about it that way, and the Tom Hanks example is what I would say to somebody who says that to me. I would say, think about Tom Hanks. The US, left to its own devices, while it's a rich economy, lots of people, lots of diversity, lots of human capital, it still cannot be that way without trade. It cannot. Right, so imports versus exports, I mean, I think, again, this is one of those things like GDP. We use it to try to say, well, this country is stronger than the other, but I think those are usually kind of not nuanced conversations about what is the real benefit of an export. The benefit of an export is that out of all the pairs of socks that you could buy in the world, you want to buy the one that's made here. Not because it's made in America, but because it's the best. And we trade based on something in economics called comparative advantage, right? Your relative comparative advantage, which means you're the lowest cost provider or producer of that thing. That, when trade is based on relative comparative advantages, everybody gets richer. Think about the woman. She's now freed from having to get the water day in and day out, right? She would prefer to import the water rather than making it herself or collecting it herself. But she's forced inward, and that exclusion from the world market is what makes her poor. So I hear that a lot. I'm sure you do as well in your classes, but I think it's just not a nuanced conversation about what makes trade good or bad. I mean, we want America to be an exporter, sure. Why? Because that means jobs for Americans, but only if what we're exporting people actually want. So to focus on the focus I think goes back to your point, entrepreneurship, innovation, human creativity, being better, and then when we're better, people will want to buy our things. But I don't think import and exports really help us that much.
So we're almost out of time. We have maybe one question left, and then I think we need to go.
Okay, sounds good.
What do we do, shalom-wise, with the profits and the leftovers?
Oh, that's a great question. So for people who didn't hear in the back maybe, when we think about shalom and the concept of shalom, how do we think about leftovers and profits, right? This is a great question because we're not, you think about Ebenezer Scrooge and Charles Dickens, right? I mean, what was his problem? He had a lot of money, and he was so obsessed with the money, it defined him, that he didn't want to use any of it because he was afraid it would go away. So my kids watch the movie version, but in the movie he's like sitting by this little tiny fire wrapped up in blankets with one piece of coal in there eating lumpy oatmeal. And you're like, what are you doing? You're rich, you could be eating filet and you're not. So I think the idea is that we don't want the riches for its own sake. That's why I bring up that example. I think we could be hedonistic about this, and I think it's very easy to be a wealthy country and then fall into the trap of consumerism. I don't think that's a product of capitalism as much as I think it's a product of our hearts. I think if we have idols, then we're going to want the next thing. It's the stuff we're going to seek to make us happy. So that's a heart transformation to me, but I think directly to your question, to be good stewards, we have to have profit. We have to. If you want leftovers, it means you are industrious with what you have. So I think the shalom version of profit seeking is that it happens within the rule of law, right? Which we're treating everybody fairly, we're not using the government to exploit, or the government is an exploiter, those types of things. But then when we have the residual, God asks us to do other things to serve others. And that could be charity, that could be church, it could be opening more businesses. You know, there's a lot of dimensions to our lives. It's not just, that's why I don't like the sacred secular divide. I think it's like, oh, I was at church on Sunday and God likes that, but now I'm an accountant and he doesn't care. No, if he created you to be an accountant, that's serving other people. And I can tell you firsthand, I'm very grateful for people who are accountants, because I can't do that by myself, right? So I think stewardship based on shalom requires right profit seeking, just profit seeking. And in that, I think we all get richer. Thank you, good question.
All right.
Thanks, guys, so much.
Thank you very much.